Yeah, yeah. So let me welcome to you all. We also have an online session, so all the presenters will be sitting behind this computer. There are 40 people who are registered on an online event, and about 25 for this session. Welcome. Do you all have the agenda of this afternoon? It was published online, sent it by email as well. Yes. There was one cancellation of the agenda. That's the presentation of UNET on the shared services. I will introduce that for 5 minutes. You can have some questions on that. Due to family circumstances, the shared services presentation will only be short than that. So for reasons of questions, we each have a presentation. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? And you can read it, the screen as well?
Not so much.
Then I will change it to the presentation mode. 1 moment. Better? Yeah. There also will be questions on the online mode, so on the chat. So if there is a question in the audience, I will repeat that question for the online participants. I have a short introduction, 10 minutes, just to introduce the events the HOME project is organizing. HOME stands for Higher Education Online MOOCs the European Way. The project is already running for more than 1 year. It will finish in the end of June 2016. It has 23 partners from 22 countries. I'm project manager from EDTU. And it's a multilateral network project. So in essence, it's organizing events and it's organizing collaboration within Europe on MOOCs. So the main aim of the project, I have some flyers in the corner. You can read it, and also the contact details are there, is to develop and strengthen an open network for European cooperation on open education, but in particularly on MOOCs. So again, it is a network project, and the network project is not only within the 23 partners. We have budget for external experts to participate, mainly travel and subsistence money to the certain events. What we already did was on the 27th of November, we had a pretty successful conference in Porto called Mapping the European MOOC Territory, and an expert meeting with some 15 experts on MOOCs in Europe on the day after. This seminar is a minor event just before Eden and is one of the events we organize. But the major events will follow at the end of this year. At the end of November, we will organize a bigger event. It most probably will be in Rome or in Istanbul, but we will release the date very soon. Presenting also the results of work package 3 to 6, and that will be discussed this afternoon as well, the main first results. And we will have a final stakeholders meeting, most likely in Dublin in April, May next year. But what are the main results for so far? It's not the results only from the HOME partners itself, the 23 partners, but many experts and many other European projects. For example, we worked first at the definition, what's a MOOC and what's not a MOOC. and I have some printouts for that. It's available at the end, with some detailed aspects, what should be or what could be a MOOC, etc. But that definition is not worked only by the 23 partners in the Home project, but also together with other projects like the EMMA project, the ECHO project, who are working on MOOCs, and the Open Ed initiative. We will not discuss this definition. You'll find this discussion elsewhere. Today will be on other issues. Last year we had an open call for position papers. So we invited experts on how they will see European cooperation on MOOCs. And we had a lot of papers submitted. 15 papers were accepted, and they were presented during the conference in Porto. And it's available as a publication on the website. Next, we did have a survey benchmarking European strategies on MOOCs. The report is available. There will be a paper in the international journal, or IROL, an open access journal, on what the European strategy is and how it differs from the United States. Antonio Teixeira, if he's on time, or he will be later, he will present the main results of that survey. In addition to the Porto conference, we also made a declaration on how we see it critical for Europe to collaborate on MOOCs, and what kind of opportunities are there, and how those opportunities should be embraced. So the Porto Declaration, it's also online. It's now supported by 80 institutions and projects and associations, is how Europe should more collaborate on MOOCs and develop a certain framework, and how the role of European Union and governments should be. We worked also on a paper on opportunities and threats for MOOCs itself, so that identifies the opportunities and threats. It will also be presented by Mark Brown later on this afternoon. And what we are now working on is also some status reports on what's happening in Europe on the didactical and pedagogical issues, on shared services, on business models. And that are the main presentations of today, just to show you the activities we are doing on those work packages, and how you, as not a partner of the Home project, can be part of the discussion and even collaborate with us. So this is a general overview. It's also to invite you to collaborate, and we will work and continue to work on those issues that we are presenting this afternoon. So if you are interested in presenting something or collaborating on issues we are addressing, we can, for example, invite you to send in paper, invite you to present in a big event later this year, etc. So there are opportunities, and there's even some small money to compensate you for travel and subsistence costs. So this is the general overview of the project itself. If you have questions on that, please welcome. As Antonio is not here yet, we do first the talk from Mark Brown. Mark Brown will refer to the presentation of Antonio, because he will be presenting the main results on the benefits and opportunities for MOOCs in, perhaps that's Antonio. Yes, he is. Yeah. So, sorry for that. Yes, we start with Mark Brown now in the presentation, and I will see if Antonio is coming. Yeah? So.
Okay. Can we go to full screen here?
How do you do full screen? that in the corner.
That one there.
No, next to it.
Next to it. Allow. Okay, and that to move forward. Yep. Well, hello everyone. My name's Mark Brown. Thank you, Darko, for the introduction. And you're going to have to kind of make some connections to when Antonio does his presentation, because I was planning on segueing into his. But I think it'll still work because he's going to operate at the macro level, although much of what I've got to talk about today is also at the macro level. Darko in his introduction mentioned that we have our special issue of Erodal, that's the International Review of Open and Distributed Learning, coming out in a few months' time. And instead of going through the papers, the two papers that I'm familiar with, having co-authored them, rather than go through those and just give a version of them, I've chosen to do something a bit different, because you can read those papers when they come out and we can probably talk about them. So I thought, given that work is going to be published, you can take your own time. So I want to introduce an evolution of the thinking at a very macro level around opportunities and threats. First, since Eb is here, a little self-promotion, and this was anticipating we may have a little time delay. Anyone who's interested in the quality issue, this report has just come out from ICDE a couple of weeks ago, so a little self-promotion to some degree. And secondly, by way of a bit of self-promotion, but it was really just as a placeholder, 10 days or so ago in Ireland, we published a Horizon report for higher education. And I won't spend any time dwelling on this, but just simply some of the opportunities and threats are identified also in the publication that are not dissimilar to some of the things I think we'll be talking about over the next few hours. So even though I'm presenting this, what I'm wanting to talk with you about actually represents a collective of quite a team of us who have been thinking about opportunities and threats that are best reflected in the publications. What Antonio is going to do is link more directly to the report that came out earlier in the year that Darko is a co-author of on institutional weak strategies in Europe, and hopefully many of you are familiar with that report, which does a similar comparison or draws on the US equivalent, and this is the first time there's been something like this in Europe, as well as the precursor to that, the e-learning in European higher education study of mapping the results at an institutional level, which came out in 2013. So those are kind of placeholders of where what I've got to say connects, and as I said, you will need to just make connections when Antonio comes in. I want to start with an organising, an anchoring statement, if you like. I do wonder about the empirical basis of this, and I've not got the skills or nor had the time to really drill down and ensure that this is empirically accurate, but I still think as a general statement, an organising statement around why MOOCs are important. John Pilger, who's from the UK and very well known throughout the world as a critical journalist, argues that despite the huge advancements in technology over the last 50 years, the wealth gap between the developed and developing countries has more than doubled. We might argue about the level with which that has occurred in different developing countries, but even within Europe itself, we know the gaps are getting wider, not closing. And so when we're talking about, for me, MOOCs, opening up education more generally, which is, I think we probably want to frame what we're talking about this afternoon much more in opening up education rather than just MOOCs per se, is a moral imperative. The challenges that we face, humanity faces, putting aside Europe, actually the world faces, education has to be at the root of many of the solutions that we are looking for. But for me, it's important just to frame it at that meta level to start with, why MOOCs are important. There are really three things that I want to cover, and I'm going to use a metaphor, and some of you may have seen this work in other places. I'm going to use a metaphor here of imagery, and hence the various colours, because I'm actually colourblind. So if you don't like the colours, tough, because they all look good to me. But I guess the reason I'm using colour and imagery as a metaphor is it depends to a large extent on the theories that you're adopting as to what you see. what shade of colour you're really seeing. And of course, in many respects, people see MOOCs as either a tremendous opportunity or alternatively as this great threat. So there's a polarised, dichotomous positioning within the literature. And the position I'm going to take is that it's much more messy than that. You may also have picked up that I've made a subtle variation on the agenda title, because the original title was The European Perspective. And I felt, as one person representing a larger team looking at the European perspective, at best all I can offer is a European perspective. Subtle but quite significant. And I'm going to draw on the perspective from really very much where I'm located now in Ireland. I'm going to use some examples there, but I hope they provide a window more generally. And then the central point I want to make about MOOCs, perhaps though more generally about opening up education, is that this is a political movement. It has many other elements to it, but fundamentally, inherently, this is a political movement. And that's why we need to be smart about the way we respond, not only pedagogically, but in policy and politics. And I draw on a very old quote that I frequently use in my presentations, but not only an old quote, but an image that's quite dear to me, because being from New Zealand, this is a scene, I think, from The Lord of the Rings, as if it might be The Hobbit. Just to remind us that an educational change, and that's what MOOCs are part of, the opening up education movement is part of a wider change movement. It's neither natural nor normal, constant or common. It involves a much deeper struggle over the nature of education, or in this context, the reference to the curriculum. My definition here of the curriculum is not with a capital letter C, but a smaller c, and curriculum means everything we do. So that really is just framing the presentation that I've got, the talk. For those who are just coming in, you're not really missing too much. So I want to start with just giving you some images of the way in which the opening up education, but more specifically the MOOC movement, is currently being presented to us. And this, I think, is very important, because what I'm going to draw on is a line of evidence which recognizes that there is no other, and this is something I'm open to challenge over, but I believe that there is no other educational innovation, no other educational technology, if you want to make it even more specific, that has found its way into the popular media, into the boardrooms of our senior management and leadership and institutions than MOOCs have in the last 100 years. I can't think of anything else that has received such popular interest. And that's why MOOCs in particular, and the wider opening up educational movement, is very important for us to engage with. Some of you may be familiar with Neil Selwyn's work, published originally back in 2000 and actually 2014 when the report was produced, and then published earlier this year in April in Higher Education Quarterly, where they did a very elegant, I think is the word I would use, analysis of the way in which MOOCs have been portrayed in the media. So just for those who were coming in, just to emphasize this point, because the story about MOOCs is playing out in the public arena like nothing else, the story that is being told about MOOCs, the story that is influencing our policymakers in the public arena, is one that we need to be engaging with and understanding how that story is being told, who is telling the story, and what is the story they're telling. In Neil Selwyn's case, just to drill down a little deeper, they reviewed 457 newspaper articles published in Australia, United Kingdom, the United States. It's a nice read, it's a really nice piece of work. A little dated now, because this was done 2013 or 2012, 13, 14. But one of the interesting findings from Neil's study, and remember I referenced previously about the dichotomous nature of the argument in relation to MOOCs, probably a bit small for you to read, but I'm just using this as a catalyst for my own interpretation. You can look at the report in more detail. Ironically, I've highlighted just one row here, where Neil points out in his team that on the one hand, the dominant assertion is that MOOCs circumvent traditional higher education systems. This is part of the language in which MOOCs are being portrayed in the literature, that they are indeed somehow challenging traditional higher education. But the flip side, or the counter assertion that in this table that Neil identifies, and I'm just pulling out one of the rows, is that the legitimacy of the MOOC, ironically, appears to come from the fact that it's associated with very high status elite universities, which are hardly challenging traditional education. So I just alert you to that one piece of work, which is a very useful, I think, analysis of some of the tensions that are being portrayed in the media. I want to go a little further though, because some of you may have seen this article in the British Journal of Educational Technology, which was only published a matter of about 2 weeks ago. It's been in pre-release for about 2 months now. Obviously, we've got some well-known people here, particularly George Siemens, who was associated with this work. So again, just drilling down a little bit, the headline that got tweeted when this paper came out is that in their analysis of the literature and the way that news stories have told the story about MOOCs, the headline was that between 2014 and 2013, or maybe reversing that, from 2013 to 2014, there has been a 50% reduction in the number of media stories about MOOCs. And some might associate that with the classical sort of Gartner hype cycle. But I think it's much more complex than that. But there could be an argument here to say, actually, the interest in MOOCs has reached its peak and now is waning. And so maybe we've missed our opportunity to shape the policy discourse. But I want to take one more example from the literature around the ways MOOCs are being told in the more general media. And in this case, this is the educational media. So this is a very recent presentation that was done, that's still a work in progress in terms of being published, that looks at the discourse of MOOCs in just 3 educational magazines. Is that a question, or you got a note there? Sorry, I can't see from here. So in the 3 magazines, the Times Higher Education, the Inside Higher Education, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, what's quite noteworthy about this study is that the story being told in the educational magazines actually differs quite a bit from the story being told in the popular press. And here you can probably see it's just the trend as much as anything. The bottom line in the bar graph refers to MOOCs and its impact on teaching. So the bulk of the stories being told in educational magazines are about the impact on teaching. That is not the case in the popular media. So there's an interesting disconnection. So having framed initially around the popular media, and perhaps my previous comment about the journal in the article in the British Journal of Educational Technology and the way in which the media are losing interest, actually many of you will be familiar with about 3 weeks ago how the media in the US again had more interest in MOOCs, and in this case it was a story in the New York Times. So whilst to some degree the media may have moved on from the year in which it was the year of the MOOC in 2012, here we have Arizona State University announcing their decision or their intention to offer credit for first year, and in fact introducing what they have called the Global Freshman Academy. And so this is a very significant development in the US, and some of us are watching this with interest in Europe. In the case of the institution that I'm from, Dublin City University, we actually have we are known as ASU's, Arizona State University's European partner. So we have quite a strong relationship with Arizona State, and we last year launched a master's degree together in biomedical diagnostics. So we're particularly interested in what they're doing and the impact that may have in our thinking here in Europe. So what that has helped us to think about is, and I think one of the things that the Home Project is going to do with this line of interest in media, it's one of our work themes, one of our particular areas that we're looking at, is think about how the media has portrayed MOOCs in your own country or region. So I just want to give you a taste of what we've found just looking at Ireland as one example. And we are inviting anyone who's interested in doing this in your own region, please talk with us. Eamon here is the other person working with me on this line of research. In the case of Ireland, the question we asked ourselves, based on the literature, is when did the first MOOC-related story appear in the Irish media? Well, the answer is 2011, but in actual fact, only 2011, which is very, very brief in the sense of a history of new technologies. But in this case, this article did not cite MOOCs. It was referring to the MIT Open Courseware Initiative. Officially, the first article was actually published in 2012, and there was just one publication in 2012 that reported MOOCs in the popular media in Ireland, just one. Then we take that to look at 2013 and 2014, and I'm not sure if you can see that, so I'll just make it clear. In 2013, 24 stories in the Irish media. 2014, 39 stories. An interesting question here, 2015, there have already been 11 stories, and if you project that on the basis of how many months have passed, that might be around about 30, mid-30s perhaps, we're predicting for 2015. So in the case of Ireland, unlike the journal article that I mentioned previously, actually the number of publications on MOOCs is continuing to increase. It is not declining. And that poses an interesting question for us in Ireland. Is it simply a case that Ireland is a bit behind the rest of the world, or are there some local factors? What we've done with this work, and I'm only going to give you a taste of a couple of slides of the way we've analysed the media, but it's very interesting that by and large, wholeheartedly, the story being told in the media about MOOCs adopts a very positive view. 78% of the stories, when we've analysed them, have a very popular, positive view about the impact that MOOCs will have. If we take a slightly different perspective on it, by and far, the majority of stories have also been about elite universities. So those who are doing MOOCs in more localised, non-elite situations do not get much airtime at all in the way that MOOCs are being portrayed. That's just to give you a very brief insight. I mentioned that there may be a couple of local explanations, and I won't take long because this is too localised perhaps for everyone's interest here, but in Ireland, arguably we have the world's very first MOOC, if you believe Forbes magazine. Allison, which is a commercial-based MOOC. So there is something unique about Ireland in that sense. And then something that's in the public domain, not well known, is that the Tata Group from India, which is actually the second largest employer in the United Kingdom now, they came to Ireland late last year and with an offer to create Ireland as the online learning destination for the world. So MOOCs here are a tremendous opportunity. For those of you who came into the room, I'm exploring threats and opportunities, came in a bit late, at a macro level. So this is quite a unique proposition for Ireland that doesn't perhaps exist. And then in the case of Ireland, in keeping with the modernisation agenda that the European Commission has for higher education, we have recently launched, only a matter of weeks ago, a national roadmap for building digital capacity. What you can't see with that little dialogue box is that if you do a search on MOOCs, in this case it's in the executive summary, you get no result. MOOCs are not referenced in the major policy document, the roadmap for digital learning in Ireland. A big disconnection is the point I'm trying to make here between the story and the amount of profile that MOOCs have in the popular media versus the educational policy. And then I want to draw on, I mentioned previously the modernisation report that was published last year, and there'll be some further iterations of that coming up. One of the key recommendations, recommendation 6 from the modernisation report last year, was that national funding frameworks need to provide more opportunities to promote flexible modes of delivery. So the key point I want to emphasise here around MOOCs and opening up education in terms of opportunities is one of access. But what the modernisation report identified is that countries have barriers, individual countries have barriers linked to funding models that are quite a restriction. In the case of Ireland, that is very much the case because we have no funding for anyone who is studying in an alternative flexible mode. So I think the key paradox in bringing this first section to a conclusion is in terms of thinking about opportunities and threats and challenges. The paradox here is that on the one hand, we understand that new online open technologies can provide access to education, provide private and public benefits for countries and individuals, but in actual fact, we have no quantifiable data to be able to substantiate what those benefits really are in an economic sense. And I say economic because if funding models are a barrier in local countries, we need to have some numbers, some economic numbers to substantiate what the real benefits are, to change policy. So this for me remains a major gap for us and is quite a challenge. So briefly, that's probably the biggest part because I'm not sure how I'm getting on time. I'm looking for indicators here. I now want to move into a different phase because I'm going to use a metaphor here, and it looks like we've got some interesting, I must have used something there, or someone had a painter go across the screen. I'm going to use a metaphor here of a kaleidoscope. I mentioned at the outset for people who didn't come in the room is I'm colorblind, so I don't see color like many of you do. But the point of this metaphor is turning the kaleidoscope just one tiny little bit, the colors change, the patterns change. So it changes, it depends on the theories that you begin with as to what you're seeing. So I'm going to be quite theoretical here, and I make no apologies because I'm operating at a grand kind of narrative level. I'm asking the questions that I posed to some degree in a previous, in the first introduction, but in a slightly different way. So when we're talking about the opportunities and challenges associated with opening up education, who's creating the image or telling the story and why? What is it they're telling, and what is it about the image that's being presented to us? Perhaps even more importantly, what images are missing? What opportunities are not being told that we could be exploring? What images or opportunities are not being created for us? So that's kind of the organizing framework for this. And as I say, I'm going to be reasonably theoretical here, but I want to anchor it in a bit of the critical literature that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I've chosen Michael Peters because his work, and these slides will be on my SlideShare site and probably on the home site for those who want to follow up the references. Michael Peters' work is probably not as well known, especially here in Europe. Michael is actually a New Zealander, and he published this work back in 2013, and I would still argue is one of the most stinging critiques of the MOOC movement in the sense in which it's a kind of marketing ploy, it's a future labour market policy for higher education, casualisation of the workforce, a kind of entertainment media, belittling serious education, using Martin Weller's work around Silicon Valley values, and you'll hear Martin at the conference as one of the keynotes talking about Silicon Valley values, and then ultimately a new business model for higher education driven by neoliberal policies. So it's a very nice piece. I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with this open access book that was published last year on the perils and promises of massive open online courses. One of the chapters asks this question, another colonialist tool. And I couldn't help but, without offending anyone here who's associated with FutureLearn or perhaps coming where English is your prime language, 2 weeks ago, FutureLearn was very, I guess, proud in announcing and promoting the fact that they had the biggest MOOC ever in the world, with 400,000 learners convening to learn English language. And for me, I kind of felt this was slightly distasteful, that such a promotion of English, and this is one of the issues, one of the threats associated with MOOCs at a meta level. In fact, the new Vice-Chancellor or President of the Open University went so far as to tweet, UK MOOC snatches world record for sign-ups, UK quality beating US dollars. Very provocative, I have to say. So these things are in the public domain and are perfect ammunition for me. So I've emphasized a couple of times now, it's the theories that we're using that are helping us to understand the threats and opportunities at a grand level. So I want to introduce a theory to you. This is a theory. It's no match with reality. It's just a thinking tool. I want to argue that at a meta level, there are two grand narratives playing out in thinking about the threats and opportunities. On the one hand, the opportunities or threats are being couched in the language of the knowledge economy. And to a lesser extent, I would argue, in twisting the kaleidoscope, we are seeing very much less of the opportunities being framed around the learning society or the knowledge society. A couple of examples, but the language here is important around the knowledge economy linked to globalization, commoditization, and some of you may be familiar with an initiatives underway between Europe and the United States with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, This is not well known, but you do need to be aware of this, and the equivalent, the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the South Pacific or Southern Hemisphere. All of these are linked about making education a commodity, a tradable commodity, and that MOOCs are a very good example of the laissez-faire commoditization of higher education. You could even argue with the modernisation report, drawing on a quote, and I may be stretching it too far. I'm sure the authors would be appalled to see me use it in this way, but I'm just looking for some of the language. We risk being left behind as parts of the world act more nimbly and garnering the benefits of technology. Left behind in what way is what I'm asking. Pedagogically, teaching and learning, or is this referring to economic disconnections or gaps? If I want to take that even further, and again I apologise to anyone who may be in the room associated with this initiative, just the headline is what's most important here. This is one of the European funded projects underlying the importance of MOOCs in building web talent, promoting web skills. Web skills for what? And if you look at the analysis, if you analyse the reasons for supporting this initiative, it's much more linked to the creation of jobs than it is to do about creating educated citizens. In the case of Ireland, I'm probably on much safer ground. So I acknowledge what I've just said is open to critique and debate. But in Ireland, in analysing the media, two examples that are very relevant, in which the economic discourse, in which opening up education is seen as providing an economic salvation, an economic opportunity for Ireland, not an opportunity to educated citizens to be well educated about the problems the world and Ireland faces. So the economic knowledge economy discourse is very strong here in the story being told. So I want to take this and make this argument that the words e-learning, digital learning, MOOCs, opening up learning, online learning, anytime, anywhere learning, flexible learning, all of these terms are being used to promote both opportunities and threats, depending upon which perspective you take. And in many respects, the same language is being used for very different ends. If I want to be very academic about this, I'll read it at the bottom because it's no doubt very small for you at the back. Different interest groups and stakeholders are borrowing the kind of language of persuasion, the same language of persuasion, but for very different legitimate ends, or for what they regard as their own ends. And just to flesh this out, and I won't take much longer because I'm sure I'm running out of time, I'm going to present 4 grand discourses around the opportunities and threats. One of them is linked to reproduction, which is historically what education has been about: reproduction privilege, mass education, quality standards, education increasingly seen as a global commodity, and creating increased market competition in which quality will be enhanced through that competition. The bulk of the MOOCs, when we analyse them and the work that we've been doing in the media in Ireland, fall actually into this reschooling view, which inherently is about monolingual delivery in English being privileged, promoting the language of a global curriculum rather than looking at local needs for local problems, and a sense in which somehow education is in crisis and needs to change, education in change. Again, these are very loose associations here as think pieces to get some reaction, but you could in many respects see Coursera and FutureLearn as the grand platforms falling into these 2 sort of perspectives. Might be a bit unfair to put Coursera in a reproduction because discourse, because increasingly Coursera is promoting more than one language, but that arguably is being driven by a US requirement, not outside of the US. Alternatively, and I'll just go through these very quickly, you have a deschooling view associated with the opportunities that opening up education has to challenge what we've done historically in traditional institutions. And the best example that I can give you of that is the open OERU, the Open Educational Resource University, or Universitas, as a truly deschooling initiative. And then lastly, the area that I probably position myself in terms of the greatest opportunities we have is more around reconception, where we value diversity. We link opening up education to the promotion of a fair and socially just society. We use education through new online technologies to address humanity's wicked problems. And then ultimately, this is about education for a kind of change for the future, not education in change that is being reactive. Best example I can give you, and probably I think in Europe, for me, the closest that fits within a reconceptualist discourse, this one will be a bit easier to see, is Open Up Ed, which at its core values diversity, multilingual, and building individual capacity, institutional capacity, not creating one kind of battleship of a platform for online course delivery. And if I want to put that into a framework, and I don't see much at all of what are known as the UNESCO pillars of learning that have been with us since the early 50s or maybe mid-50s. Learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, and learning to live together. These are promoted as the pillars of education, and I see them as a very robust framework to be talking about how MOOCs can really promote a different kind of education, the opportunities that we have, except I would add a fifth pillar, or in this case the metaphor isn't pillars, but more like a change ball needing to learn, to change and transform. So I'd like to see more talk in relation to MOOCs and opening up education in the context of these long-standing pillars, which just so happen to be used in the lifelong learning literature here in Europe. And again, you won't be able to see this. I invite you to look at the slides afterwards, but this diagram has each of the countries in Europe, or many of the countries in Europe, and a scorecard on how well we are doing against those pillars. And we're actually not doing that well, which is another reason why we need to embrace this reconceptualist discourse. In certain parts of Europe, we're not doing very well at all. So in wrapping up, I won't take more than a couple of minutes here. What I'm wanting to argue is what I'd like to see more discussion in terms of opening up education and the opportunities as distinct from the threats, really talking about what actually we want to achieve in the long term associated with both MOOCs, but more generally the opening up education movement. Alvin Toffler reminded us that all education springs from images of the future, and all education creates images of the future. So we really need to have a much clearer sense of what kind of preparation for the future we're engaged in, and in fact, more importantly, what type of future we want to create. So I guess my challenge here is, and it's not original by any stretch of the imagination, but asking fundamentally the question, what type of education system do we want MOOCs to serve us in the future? Or perhaps more broadly, opening up education. I don't believe there is enough discussion around the opportunities in that respect. I think we could make much more use of scenario planning tools for the future, because we all know we cannot predict the future, but there are quite well-developed scenario planning tools to help us shape that future. And so in the case of the institution that I'm from, we've used these scenario planning tools, and this is just a kind of example. You can look at these tools to think about the different scenarios that might exist in the future, but also to be proactive as a future maker than a future taker. And we've kind of positioned ourselves in an area that gives us an opportunity to go in different directions depending on what scenario. And we have a brand that we launched, a platform called DCU Connected, which is not using the word online at all, because we see online as a very, very passé term. I won't talk any more about that other than just to wrap up with 3 key points. So I started, for those who came in late, by making a case that when we're talking about opening up education, or MOOCs more specifically, this is political work. Education is inherently political, and that's why we need to be debating and engaging in debate at that level. Secondly, I want to emphasize, whilst some people think MOOCs are passé, that MOOCs are just the latest fad, I regard MOOCs as a gift if you are in the business of, and I use business in inverted commas, as a change agent and someone wishing to change policy. This is a grand opportunity for us to take advantage of, especially given the level of public interest. And we have a small window, I believe, as a profession to take advantage of that. But ultimately, we need to know where we want to go. And I just don't think we're talking enough with the long-term, the longer-term game in mind. There is too much short-sighted thinking here. Where do we want to go? And it might again be a little popularist, but this is a quote that I borrowed with my colleague Eamon from someone else. MOOCs should be seen in the service of big ideas, not the big idea itself. So when we're thinking about the threats and opportunities, but particularly the opportunities, what is the big idea that we're trying to achieve through opening up education? That's got to be our sole main question. So thank you. I've probably taken a little longer than I was allocated, with no knowledge of whether you turn up here, Antonio. Thank you, everyone, and I don't know how much time we have for questions.
Well, thank you, Mark. You perhaps have the questions later on, because on the online meeting, people are scheduled to follow this meeting, and we have a break at 4:15. Antonio has to leave also in 20 minutes, 50 minutes, so let's switch now to the presentation of Antonio. He has to be uploaded for a few seconds. Sorry for the inconvenience for the number of seats. We had an online registration for people. It was only 25, 30 people, and most books are massive, so bad anticipation. Sorry for that. Antonio will give a presentation on the opportunity on the download on the survey report of the whole project. And the survey report was sent out as a survey amongst European institutions. And European institutions can be from the wider area, the Bologna area of Europe. The survey was conducted by the end of 2014, and will be repeated every year. So there is a survey already in the United States, and it's executed by the Boston Group, and it provides a good benchmarking on US institutions. And this survey is benchmarking the European institutions against also what's happening in the US. And there are some surprising results Antonio will tell you about. Next to all ages.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'll just skip. Okay, can I start? Can I start that one?
Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for my being late, but as you know, with several of you, I was a little bit mixed up with the room numbers, but seems like that happens. All of them were 7, but not exactly in the same floor. But anyway, so as Darko has just introduced, the topic that I'm going to address is institutional MOOC strategies in Europe, and it is based on the results of this survey that was conducted in the framework of the Home Project, and in the comparison of those results with also surveys that have been launched by both surveys in the US and a survey, quite a big survey, that was launched by the European University Association by US. So, okay. My first slide is about, well, so I'll start the presentation by basically addressing the issue from our own perception or preconception in a sense, and then we'll go to the survey results and try to find if our ideas about this topic match what actually the survey results are or not. So this is the first thing that we have to bear in mind. This is the most recent, I would say, at least until 2 days or 3 days ago, results of the scoreboard. As you know, the Open Education Europe has this scoreboard running, and this is a good demonstration of how the phenomenon of MOOCs has caught up in Europe, and is being catching up, especially in Western Europe, but it's catching up all over the continent. More interesting than this first slide, which most of you know, because almost in every conference and every presentation, the presenter will start by having a slide with the scoreboard, is this one, which seldom is shown. And this represents the number of institutions who claim on Open Education Europa to be providers of open education. And this is the really interesting thing. It's not the amount of courses that is provided, but the amount of institutions that claims to be open education provider. In those institutions, you'll find, if you have the breakdown of these data, you'll find a mixture of several kinds of providers. You'll find institutions, but you'll find also platforms. You'll find also companies. Well, it's a complex thing. But the basic conclusion is that if we look at these from, well, I would say 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we were asking in your country who are the open education providers. Well, most of us will think about the open university, the national open universities, or one or two other flexible learning institutions being connected or not with an association. Well, now we find that these are not related to associations; they are related with individual organizations that are claiming to be open education providers. So this is a clear indication as well of how things are changing from an institutional point of view, and how nowadays for an institution to claim to be an open education provider is no longer some kind of an exotic thing. It's something that they have to do in order to stay afloat. So any institution nowadays, especially in the higher education sector, if they don't claim to be providing some kind of open education, they're out of their business. And this has been quite a dramatic shift from what happened before. But there is also an important element that should be addressed even before we analyze the results from the survey, which is, what do we mean? I mean, what is driving this open education expansion? Traditionally, as you know, and this happened also with the start of the open educational resources movement, these had a lot to do with inclusion, mainly with social inclusion, but also cultural inclusion, or even inclusion on a different level as well. But afterwards, and we spotted that mainly at the last decade, the driver has been innovation. So to innovate practice, to change the practice, and that is what explains, for instance, the transition from the open educational resources movement to the open educational practices movement, which one of the main features of open educational practices concept was exactly that those practices had to be innovative in order to be considered an open educational practice. Otherwise, it would be an open educational resource, but not necessarily a practice. However, what actually is driving open education provision these days, and especially in the higher education sector, is another I, which is internationalization. So cross-border provision of education provision is nowadays something that is completely assumed as part of the mission of the institutions, part of their business model as well. And so this is what is most well in recent years, and especially when we look at how the MOOC movement has been cutting up with institutions, especially at the decision-making level. It has been the globalization element, and so internationalization. Well, as you know, there were prior to this, the FOM project organized a conference in Porto last November, and from that conference, there was a declaration issued in which a large amount of institutions in Europe, which were represented at that conference, agreed on a number of elements regarding what was the status of art of the movement in Europe today. And these are probably the most important conclusions of that, or the most important remarks made in that declaration. First of all, it's important to review them also to match our preconception, in a sense, regarding this phenomenon. First of all, of course, MOOCs are an important driver for change. Once again, the innovation element. Its impact has helped institutions, governments, and societies become more aware of the possibilities of open online education. This is clearly something that has been also identifiable with the way things have been evolving. Another one, evidence suggests that MOOCs are not reaching those more in need for accessing higher education. This actually is quite interesting result that has been spotted firstly with the results from Coursera, and now has also been confirmed with additional initiatives, which is the fact that inclusion, this traditional driver for open education, is not actually being a concrete element in the expansion of MOOCs, because most of them, as you know, participants in MOOCs are people actually who are already having some kind of a formal education, and so this is not clearly an element of inclusion at this stage. Of course, one of the other aspects that is important for institutions is connected with another conclusion, which is that there is the danger for the most important, the most dominant higher education institutions, globally in a global perspective, to dominate, of course, the higher education sector, and in that sense, medium-sized and smaller-sized institutions being clearly either kicked out of the system or being in a more difficult position regarding the larger institutions. Another element, however, that we'll be addressing later on is the fact that in spite of all of these conclusions, there is an underlying aspect, which is the fact that we've not still reached an agreement on what actually are we referring to when we talk about MOOCs. There are different definitions, apart from the traditional difference between what we could call an X-MOOC and a C-MOOC. There are much more important aspects that related to the fact that the MOOC definition is not still a standard one. The following issue, the following conclusion of this declaration is an important one, because it also relates to how Europe is addressing this challenge, and it relates to the fact that the European response to the challenge provided by massive education expansion, or provision of massive education, the expansion of that provision, is that our response should be aligned with our own values and our own tradition of learning, and also the traditional social elements that were also highlighted in Mark's presentation. So we should not just offer the same, but we should try to offer something different that has to do, that is connected, that is linked with our own traditional values. This, of course, implies a collective response, and universities need to strengthen their collaboration for it. Well, let's now see if this matches the results of the surveys, or at least the comparison between the results of the surveys. These are the surveys that have been used and has already been, Darko in his presentation had mentioned. So the first one is the survey conducted by the Babson Survey Research Group in the US. The second one is on the right, is the one that was conducted by the European University Association, and the third one is the one conducted by the Home Project and the ADTU in the framework of the Home Project. How am I about time? It's okay. It's okay. So, first of all, there are some interesting differences on how these surveys were designed and conducted. The first aspect relates, or the first two aspects relates to the fact that was already mentioned before, which is what are we talking about when we're addressing this issue. So when institutions are responding to these surveys, what is on their minds? I mean, what kind of definition of MOOCs do they have, And so what are they responding to, in a sense? And what is here clearly stated, and it's important to note, is that every institution in itself is deciding what will be provided in the format of MOOCs, and exactly what they define as MOOCs itself. And so the fact that we're not talking about the same thing, of course, has some implications in the results that of this service. Comparing the service themselves, of course, they're from the US surveys, both these ones that were conducted in 2013 and 2014, they are biased in the sense that they are very majorly focused on the big institutions, on the larger institutions, so on the larger traditional institutions that also offer open education. The EUA, sorry about the misspelling, the EUA study is biased because it favors institutions that are already involved in e-learning. So when we compare the results of the surveys, we have to understand that they are not exactly targeting the same profile of institutions. On the opposite, regarding our own survey, it is biased also in the sense that the institutions that responded to the survey are institutions that, by doing it in the form that they've done it, also are already showing their interest on the phenomenon. So these are different things because the institutions that responded to the US survey are not necessarily involved in MOOCs or have interest on it because the survey was not necessarily conducted in that framework. The EUA survey was directed at e-learning provision, and MOOCs was part of it. And the home project survey was more focused on the MOOC phenomenon itself. So that has to be taken into consideration when we now see the results. Well, some of the broad results of the survey are the following. European institutions are more involved in MOOCs than the US, but this has to be also seen also to be taken into account with the fact that these institutions that responded in Europe are already in some way connected with the movement. The number of European institutions involved in MOOCs is increasing. That is a clear fact. MOOCs are perceived in Europe as a sustainable format of course provision. That relates also with the remarks that were made by Mark in his presentation. That is clear as well. In Europe, the institutions are increasingly developing a positive attitude to MOOCs and have positive experiences of their added values, which is different from what we'll see in the US survey, or the results of the US survey. So there is a more favorable approach by the European institutions than there is in the US, which is a more critical one. Most dominant, in all studies, there is an increase institutional visibility and using MOOCs for reputation reasons. This is also an important element. So there is a difference between how this is perceived in terms of institutional strategy in the US and in Europe, as we'll see. And this relates to the final conclusion. In the US, MOOCs are perceived basically by the institutions as useful for student recruitment, and so they are used in that perception. Of course, this is the result of the survey. We know a lot of individual examples that show exactly a different kind of approach, but anyway, this is from the broad perspective of the survey. And while in Europe, of course, opposite to this, the main aim is to reach for new target groups, so to reach out for new kinds of students and also to create flexible learning opportunities. So, getting to specific items in the survey. This related to the relevance of the objectives related to the MOOC provision. And you can see here how, so I don't know if it's, if everyone can see this. Well, I'll try to read it. So on the left, you see demands of learners and societies. These actually represents the blue, not all relevant for my institution, then the the orange somewhat relevant for my institution, gray neither irrelevant or relevant, the yellow relevant for my institution, and the blue, the darker blue, highly relevant for my institution. And you can see that there is quite a strong element on this is of course related to the home project survey. There is a clear focus on being either relevant for my institution or highly relevant for my institution. Regarding the innovation area, so the potential for innovation in the MOOC provision, also the same phenomenon applies, a little bit even more highlighted. Reputation and visibility, the same applies. Regarding financial, financial reasons, which means that, of course, the results are different, which means that this is not so relevant for European institutions. So they are not this push toward MOOC provision is not driven by financial reasons at all. As you can see, only a very small number of institutions declare it as an important element. Primary objectives. This relates to the previous slide. Well, maybe this will be even harder to see, but what it I can basically, well, I can read the first one. So generate income is clearly not, and because it compares, well, the yellow is the EU survey from 2014, the gray, the EU, not just on MOOC offering, but on the overall approach. The US are the orange and the blue ones. But, well, since it's a little bit difficult for you to see it, well, not for the online participants, but for the ones here, I'll just highlight that this is clearly, regarding generating income, this is clearly more important for the US than for the European results. This is comparing the European with the US respondents. Learn about scaling, that is only relevant for the US. Explore cost reductions, only for the US. Supplement on campus, that is more relevant for European. And reach new students, once again. Flexible learning opportunities, once again. So this basically confirms what has been said before. Online recruitment, this is different, so it's the US who are more interested in these objectives. And of course, increase institutional visibility. This is relevant for all of them. How well are MOOCs meeting institutional objectives? This is interesting to compare the results, because once again you can see that opposite to the more favorable approach from the European side, the US are clearly more suspicious, in a sense, more critical to, or at least they say that it's too early to tell. So they're not so confident about this. Are MOOCs a sustainable method for offering courses? Here, it's clear also that, well, the blue stands for agreement, neutral is the orange, and disagreement the gray. So here, once again, you see that it's clearly positive position from the EU perspective, and not such a positive, I would say that probably negative, more negative approach, or clearly negative approach from the US, as you can see. Are MOOCs important for institutions to learn about online pedagogy? This once again confirms what has been said before. So the overwhelming response from the EU side is that they agree, and of course from the American side is a completely different one. So it's more on the disagreement level than on the agreement level, although the report from 2013 was still a little bit more favorable than the following up on 2014. Well, to finalize, what can we conclude from this. There is also an important element that, well, I'm not sure if Mark mentioned, but it's a clear one as well, which is the fact that if you look at how MOOCs have been developing in Europe, and also especially how this relates to the European Commission's strategy, you'll find that there are a lot of projects going on at this stage, EU-funded projects going on in Europe, and most of them have started some kind of collaboration or some kind of communication at least, which also relates to the fact that this is a new field, but this is a new field that is driving institutions and, well, researchers in a sense to collaborate more than usual. Of course, when we look at these milestones, so the fact that the European Commission launched a specially designed strategy aimed at fostering opening up education, and of course the fact that it related to these main goals, which is to innovate teaching and learning, and also to reshape and modernize European education, these two elements once again relate to the fact that there is a push from the political side to actually not just reach for the community of practice in a sense, but also very much to focus on the redesign, or at least the modernization, as it is here stated. Well, I would say, well, in a sense, to some change, some transformation of the institutional models. And this is quite ambitious, because if you look at universities, you'll find them as the most traditional institutions in Europe as such. I mean, in the 1980s, there was a famous sociological study in England when they tried, in the UK, when they tried to identify what were in the last 200 years the institutions that changed the least in English society, and they reached the conclusion that out of 20, 18 were universities. So this is natural; it's on the core of the university to be traditional, and so not to change. But the fact is that this open education push has led many institutions to consider that this change is more it's more than a challenge, it's a need, and they have to address it. And of course, the European Commission support to that has been helping as well. But anyway, what is interesting is to link that with the expansion of the MOOC movement and how the MOOC phenomenon has actually led to that. As Mark was saying, MOOCs are not passé. Well, at least in Europe, they're not passé. And the survey results clearly show that there is an interest, a sustained interest, that is not equal to the one in the US, apart from the biases of the surveys that I've mentioned at first. But the fact that it's not passé also it links with an important element, I would say, that is this connection with the need for institutional change, which is not so much seen in the US as is seen in Europe as a priority. And so this is this could be also one of the reasons why in Europe the MOOC movement still is in a sense increasing its outreach and still is still growing. But so it's funny to relate to this famous slide by Stephen Downes when he was explaining the collaborative approach, the connectivist approach on MOOC design, that while a central directed approach doesn't scale, a connectivist approach scale, and this is probably a good metaphor for what happens when you compare the two systems, the American system, the higher education system, which is basically what we're comparing, to the European system. As you know, the American system is a very structured one. So you have a first tier of excellent universities, a second tier of not so excellent ones that are clearly separate from the Ivy League in a sense, and then a basis of many institutions which are not of very good quality. In Europe, it's different. So the difference between the level of quality and the dimension, it's not so structured it's not so structured, and in that sense, there's a greater diversity, and the way that the MOOC phenomenon has been happening in Europe also relates to this difference in how the system is organized and how it works and can evolve. And so, to sum up and to conclude, because I think I've wasted my time, is that maybe this is what could bring MOOCs such a momentum in terms of its approach in Europe, which is the fact that, well, I already shown in my last slide, which is the fact that it can help not only reshape institutions, but work with a different kind, less structured and more, in that sense, more connectivist organization of the European higher education system. Well, and thank you very much.
We have some time for some questions. The presentation from Fred de Vries on the pedagogical didactical approach will be after the break. So we have some questions because one presentation on shared services done by UNED will not be done today. So after the break we have 3 presentations on didactical approaches on MOOCs, on business models, and on an open network aspect. But perhaps there are some questions from Antonio, because Antonio will have to leave right after the break. At the break now. So if you have some questions on his presentation or even for Mark Brown's presentation, please. Otherwise, we have a break for 20 minutes. Yeah.
And Mark Brown's presentation was very interesting content, and just wanted to ask that you share the slides.
Yeah. All the slides of the event will be placed on the home website. There you can also download the reports. The home website is home.edu.au. There are some flyers from the home project at the table at the back. And then we will provide next week all the slides as well. And also the recordings. We will record the session, the online session as well. The recording will be available.
My slides are also available on SlideShare, and my SlideShare name is in Brown Z. Brown.
No, they were not online yet, though. I checked.
Just check those questions from the forum.
Yeah.
Let's see.
There was someone on blended.
Again about the presentations. No. Any online questions? This is your chance. We have 17 people online at the moment, so.
Of course, what Antonio is saying, the strengths on scalability not only counts for the participation of MOOCs, but also in collaborating. And that's also addressed as a possible threat, because the diversity in approaches is also a threat for Europe, because every time we reinvent the wheel, there's a project developing translation services, and then there's another project translation services, etc. Everyone starts his own MOOC. The main issue is how to get people working together and sharing the results and sharing services on MOOCs. And that needs some light coordination and that. So that's also what the whole project is doing, collaborating with other projects and try to make some collaboration effective between many initiatives in Europe. Yeah, there's another question.
Both presentations, I was curious about the role of language. In the US, moves, there's an assumption it's going to be in English, but in Europe, they have different challenges given that we have so many different audiences. So can you talk at all about how language informs both the survey as well as the general vision of
Yes,
repeat, please.
Sorry,
I think it's the language.
that's a crucial absolutely crucial distinction, if you like, between the Coursera's, the edX, FutureLearn in the UK, is that language is at the core as well as diversity, respecting cultural diversity. So that takes us in a different direction. So using the framework I was, reconception, in which diversity is valued and not seen as a problem. So in many respects, all of the discussion we've had, the opportunities we see can also be seen as threats.
Yeah.
And it's about how you see and frame that.
Well, I would just add, well, if I can comment, the language element here in Europe is playing quite an interesting role on two ways. First of all, there is the element of diversity. If you look at the MOOC offering in Europe, you'll find MOOCs in already several languages, several national languages. But apart from that, there is also several projects are developing translation, automatic translation processes, or other kinds of approaches that would lead to the possibility to form multilinguistic learner communities. However, apart from the language itself, there is the cultural element. So apart from multi-language or multilinguistic, there is a clear trend to try to build multicultural experiences. And that in that sense are more open to those elements, which are typically or traditionally connected with European legacy than in the US, which for them, that problem is not a major problem, not a major one, isn't it?
And another issue that is in Europe is the small languages. They don't need a big platform because they scale up for 4,000 participants. And 4,000 participants is already huge compared for a small language area like Lithuania or Slovenia, etc. So they can host it more in their own institution, still have a MOOC. There's a lot of participants they normally won't reach. If someone's interested in a language issue in the survey, it was not mentioned.
Yeah.
But if you like to suggest, we will repeat the survey next year again. We will repeat the questions the US survey has because of the benchmark with the US. But we also have some additional questions. So if you have suggestions or some question on that, please contact me.
Let's give one online question. Daniel is asking a question here. How about delivering MOOCs in Europe in a sort of, I don't know what it means, blended learning mode?
Well, I can. Well, I don't know if you want to add to.
I think we very quick and then hand over to you, Antonio. If I understand that question, is what we're starting to see people be much more creative in how MOOCs can be applied. So I'm familiar with a number of examples in which MOOCs are being used for a blended experience in which a cohort of learners come together and use the framework of the MOOC for some face-to-face. That's being done. One example, two examples, probably first is around professional learning of how to teach online. There's some very good MOOCs in that area, but probably the much better example from our own university, where we have a strong interest in intergenerational studies and framing aging as an asset, not a deficit. As people get older, as a real resource that you can draw on. These people are coming together. They also arguably lack some IT skills. So they're coming together and having an opportunity to work on a MOOC once a week, I think it is, that they are able to talk to each other about their experience. If someone hasn't done it that week, they can support one another. And that's happening at a grassroots level. The MOOC provides a very powerful opportunity, depending, of course, also on some of the topics. So in our own case, we have an interest in dementia. And that's one of the areas that we will be pursuing in the near future. So that's obviously of topical interest to not only the elderly, but also to their families.
Well, that's one perspective. So to invert the classroom approach. Another one is also interesting, which is already been followed by several institutions, starting by the APFL in Lausanne in Switzerland, which is to allow for students in formal programs, because that's also a very important discussion. If we're talking about formal learning experiences or non-formal learning experiences, typically they are non-formal. Although the blend, the frontier, the border between what is non-formal and formal, it's getting fuzzy. And in particular, in some of these experiences, for instance, what Pierre Dillenboom is doing in the APFL, is to allow in a formal curriculum to students to replace, in a sense, parts of their curriculum. So courses and their curriculum with MOOCs that they do outside, and those credits, that learning is transformed into credits that is recognized for formal. So it has a formal recognition system. Also, in some of the Open Up Ed initiatives, there is a possibility to award formal certification to MOOCs, which also is a bridge for these non-formal experiences to become part of a formal experience. And in that sense, there's also a blended learning approach in the fact that during the experience of a program, the student can mix typical traditional face-to-face experiences with fully online ones as well. Not in a typical blended approach, but this kind of mixture is also having an importance these days.
Sorry, so we had to finish for the break because we have a short break for coffee and some refreshments. We will start in 20 minutes, so 10 minutes before 5. There will be 3 presentations after the break. So we hope to finish at 6 o'clock, so that you all have the opportunity to attend to the opening ceremony of the evening conference, which starts at 30 minutes past 7 o'clock. So we are aiming to finish about 6:15 that you all can attend to the opening ceremony. So sorry for that you not could have a question. We have some coffee and some refreshments outside, and we'll be back in 20 minutes for the other 3 presentations. Thank you.
A bit of a rush on the coffee.
Yeah.
Probably the